30 people, Diane said, dropping a printed sheet onto my kitchen counter. Start cooking at 4 tomorrow morning. I stared at my mother-in-law, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. The page in front of me looked less like a Thanksgiving menu and more like a catering order. Turkey, glazed ham, stuffing, macaroni and cheese, mashed potatoes, vegetables, rolls, appetizers, 3 desserts. All of this, I asked. Who's bringing the sides? Diane's eyebrows lifted. Nobody, you're hosting. Before I could answer, my husband Mark walked into the kitchen. I expected him to look at that ridiculous list and tell his mother she was asking too much. Instead, he glanced over my shoulder and said, "And make sure everything is perfect this time." Something inside me went completely still. I smiled. Of course. Neither of them noticed that my smile was an agreement. It was goodbye. I was 32, working full-time, and I had finished work barely an hour before Diane arrived with her orders. Mark, meanwhile, had taken the entire week off. He hadn't chopped an onion, peeled a potato, or prepared a single thing. "So you'll handle the turkey?" I asked him. Mark laughed. "Mom used to do this every year. 30 people isn't that serious." "Exactly," Diane said. "And people still remember what happened with your gravy 2 years ago." I looked from Diane to my husband. Tomorrow, they expected me to wake before sunrise, cook for 30 members of his family, serve them, clean afterward, and smile while they evaluated whether I had finally passed whatever test Diane had invented for being a Mercer wife. Then I noticed something. Besides several names on Diane's guest list were small handwritten initials. "What are those?" Diane immediately picked up the sheet. "Nothing you need to worry about." That answer stayed with me. Later that night, Mark was showering when his phone lit up on the nightstand. A notification from the Mercer family group appeared. "Are you sure Ginna doesn't want us bringing anything?" My eyes dropped to the message directly beneath it. Mark had already replied. "Mom says absolutely not." I froze. People had offered to help. Diane had refused them. And Mark knew. When he came to bed, I said nothing. I kissed him goodnight and waited until his breathing became slow and heavy. Then I reached for my phone. Mark thought my alarm would ring at 4. Instead, I set it for ***2, 15 a.m. Then I slid out of bed, reached underneath it, and quietly pulled out my suitcase. Because suddenly, the question wasn't how I would cook Thanksgiving dinner for 30 people. It was why Diane had made absolutely certain I would have to do it alone. I waited until Mark was completely asleep before I picked up his phone again. The family group chat was still open. I scrolled upward, expecting maybe 1 or 2 relatives had casually offered to help. Instead, I found offer after offer. Aunt Rebecca had written, "I can bring the pumpkin and pecan pies. That'll save Ginna some work." Diane had answered, "No need. Ginna has desserts covered." Mark's cousin offered 2 casseroles. "Absolutely not," Diane replied. "She's handling the meal." Another relative offered appetizers. Diane refused those too. I stared at the screen. This wasn't poor planning. They had deliberately created the situation. Then I found a private message from Diane to Mark that explained why. She needs to learn what being a Mercer wife actually means. My stomach tightened. But Mark's reply was worse. "Leave it to her. She'll complain, but she'll do it." I read those words twice. Mark knew exactly how unfair this was. He also knew exactly why I would probably tolerate it. For years, whenever I objected to spending an entire holiday cooking while he watched football with his relatives, he had the same response. "Why do you always have to create drama?" If I complained about Diane criticizing my food, I was too sensitive. If I asked Mark to help, I was embarrassing him. And because I hated confrontation, eventually I would give in. That was what "she'll do" * meant. I quietly took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself. The next morning, Diane called. Turkey needs to go in early, she said. Don't wait until the last minute. I looked at the suitcase hidden inside my closet. Don't worry, Diane. There was a pause. Good, because everyone is expecting a proper Thanksgiving. I almost laughed. Tomorrow will be different. She heard obedience. I meant something else entirely. For once, I wasn't going to argue with Mark until he offered another apology he didn't mean. I wasn't going to convince Diane that I deserved basic consideration. I was going to say no, without asking permission. And then I would see what my marriage looked like, when Mark could no longer rely on me surrendering. That night, Mark kissed my forehead. 4 a.m., he reminded me. Don't oversleep. I won't. At *11, 47 p.m. asterisk, while he slept beside me, I opened the airline app. My reservation appeared. I pressed *check in asterisk. Flight, 3:35 a.m. I slipped the boarding pass into my coat pocket. Tomorrow morning, 30 people were coming for Thanksgiving dinner. And the woman they'd ordered to cook wouldn't even be in the state. At *3:00 a.m. asterisk, Mark was still asleep. I was in the back seat of a car, heading toward the airport with one suitcase beside me. I had left the kitchen exactly as Diane and Mark had left it. The turkey was still wrapped. The potatoes were still in their bags. The vegetables were untouched. Not one pie had been baked. At *3:35 a.m. asterisk, my plane lifted off the runway. While Diane probably imagined me standing over a stove, preparing her perfect Thanksgiving, I was looking down at the city disappearing beneath the clouds. Mark woke around 8. I learned later that he walked into the kitchen, expecting to smell turkey. Instead, he found darkness. Ginna. He checked the bedroom, then the bathroom, then the kitchen again. That was when the calls started. By the time I turned on airplane mode, I already had several missed calls. Diane arrived soon afterward. What do you mean she's gone? I don't know, Mark snapped. Diane opened the refrigerator. Everything she and Mark had purchased for me to cook was still sitting there unopened. You have 30 people coming. I know that, Mom. Then call her. I am. But I was 30,000 feet above them. By late morning, the doorbell started ringing. Aunt Rebecca was among the first relatives through the door. She looked toward the empty dining table. Where's Ginna? Diane immediately answered. She disappeared, after promising she would host everyone. Rebecca frowned. Disappeared. She left without preparing anything. Rebecca looked toward the kitchen, then back at Diane. But I offered to bring the desserts. Diane went quiet. You told me Ginna didn't want anyone helping. Another relative standing nearby turned around. Wait, you told me that too. I offered appetizers. The room changed. Suddenly, people weren't asking why I had left. They were asking why Diane had refused their help. Mark stepped in. Look, Ginna agreed to handle Thanksgiving. Rebecca stared at him. Okay. Then she pointed toward the untouched kitchen. So what were *U* supposed to be doing? Mark had no answer. More cars pulled into the driveway. More relatives entered. 10 people became 15. Then 20. Eventually, nearly 30 hungry guests were standing inside a house where the turkey was still raw and the potatoes hadn't even been peeled. Diane started issuing frantic instructions, but people weren't moving the way she expected. Some were whispering. Others were checking their phones, comparing messages. And for the first time, Mark was standing in the middle of his own family with everyone expecting him to solve the problem he'd told me wasn't that serious. Hours later, my plane landed. I switched my phone back on. The screen exploded with notifications. Mark called again immediately. This time I answered. Hello. His voice came through tight and furious. You need to get on the next flight home. I was standing in my father's quiet kitchen when Mark ordered me to come home. Behind me, Dad was setting two simple place settings on the table. No 30-person guest list. No inspection. No one demanding that I prove I belonged. You need to get on the next flight home, Mark repeated. Do you understand what you've done? Everyone is here. I leaned against the counter. I understand perfectly. You humiliated me, Ginna. There it was. Not are you okay? Not why did you leave? Not even can we talk. His humiliation. I lowered my voice. Mark, why did you tell everyone not to help me? Silence. For several seconds, I heard nothing but muffled voices behind him. Then he said, What? Aunt Rebecca offered pies. Your cousin offered casseroles. Someone else offered appetizers. Diane rejected all of them. Another silence. And you knew. Ginna. I saw the messages. That stopped him. I continued. I saw what your mother wrote about teaching me what being a Mercer wife means. His breathing changed. And I saw your answer. She'll complain, but she'll do it. Mark didn't deny it. Instead, he said, You are completely overreacting. I almost couldn't believe it. You could have made your point after Thanksgiving, he continued. You didn't have to do this with 30 people coming. That sentence told me everything. My humiliation could wait. My exhaustion could wait. My boundaries could wait. As long as Mark never had to be inconvenienced. Back at our house, things were unraveling faster. Rebecca and several relatives began comparing the messages Diane had sent them. One cousin showed everyone her offer to bring 2 casseroles. Another pulled up Diane's refusal of appetizers. Diane could no longer claim nobody had volunteered. People had volunteered. She had deliberately stopped them. And Mark had helped her do it. Several relatives decided they weren't spending Thanksgiving scrambling to rescue a situation Diane had intentionally created. They left. Others started ordering takeout. Mark lowered his voice when he spoke again. If you don't come back and apologize, we're going to have a serious problem. I looked across the room. Dad had heard enough to understand what was happening, but he didn't interfere. He simply placed a glass of water beside my plate. I finally answered Mark. We already do. Ginna, I'm not coming back until we're ready to discuss what this marriage has become. He hung up. I placed my phone on the counter. For the first time all day, the room was completely quiet. Then the phone rang again. I expected Mark. The name on the screen made me straighten. Rebecca. I answered. Hello. Her voice was low. Ginna, I'm standing in your kitchen right now. She paused. And I think everyone finally understands why you left. Rebecca didn't ask me to come back. That was the first thing that surprised me. She simply said, Tell me exactly what happened. So I did. Diane handed me a list for 30 people and told me to start cooking at 4 in the morning. I asked who was bringing the sides. She said nobody. Rebecca sighed. I offered to bring 2 pies. I know. There was silence. I continued. I saw the family messages. You weren't the only one who offered. Diane rejected everything. And Mark knew. Yes. I told her about Diane's message. She needs to learn what being a Mercer wife actually means. Then I told her Mark's response. She'll complain, but she'll do it. Rebecca went quiet again. That message was the real reason I was sitting hundreds of miles away with my father. I had spent years arguing, explaining, and eventually surrendering. Every time Mark apologized, the same pattern returned. This time, I didn't argue. When Diane ordered me to start cooking at 4, I smiled because I had finally stopped trying to earn their approval. My father had already invited me to spend Thanksgiving with him. So I booked the flight. I packed. And I left Mark responsible for the Thanksgiving dinner he'd told me wasn't that serious. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "I'm sorry, Ginna." I swallowed. "For what?" "For letting them treat you like the hired help." Back at the house, Diane was standing in the middle of a kitchen filled with untouched groceries. The turkey was still raw. 30 guests had been expected. But once everyone understood why there was no dinner, several relatives grabbed their coats and left. One cousin confronted Diane before walking out. "You told us Ginna didn't want help." "I was trying to maintain a tradition," Diane argued. "No, you were testing her." The Thanksgiving Diane had wanted to control ended with takeout containers scattered across the table, and only a fraction of the original guests remaining. But Mark still didn't understand. For the next several days, his messages weren't apologies. They were demands. "You made us look ridiculous. Mom deserves an apology. You can't just abandon your husband when you're angry." Finally, I called him. "I'll come back under 3 conditions," I said. "You take responsibility for what happened. We establish boundaries with your mother. And from now on, family obligations are shared." Mark laughed bitterly. "So you're giving me conditions now?" "Yes." "And you're still not apologizing to Mom?" "No." That was his opportunity. He could have chosen our marriage. Instead, he said, "Then maybe you shouldn't come home." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Okay." His voice changed. "What?" I said okay. After Thanksgiving, I returned while Mark was away. Rebecca came with me. I packed clothes, documents, personal belongings, everything I needed, and moved temporarily into an apartment of my own. I separated our finances. Mark suddenly had to manage the things he'd barely noticed when I handled them. His meals, laundry, family commitments, and Diane's constant expectations. We eventually tried counseling. But even there, Mark kept returning to the same belief. A wife was supposed to support her husband. What he meant by support was obedience. When it became clear that he wanted the old arrangement restored rather than a partnership built, I filed for divorce. Diane lost something too. Her family no longer treated her as the unquestioned authority over every gathering. The next major celebration wasn't held at her house. Someone else hosted. People brought food. Nobody was assigned a test. Months later, I hosted my own small dinner. 8 people. That was all. Rebecca arrived carrying dessert. Someone else brought vegetables. Dad stood at the counter, carving the turkey, while I put glasses on the table. "Need anything?" Rebecca asked. I looked around. Everyone was contributing. Nobody was inspecting me. Nobody was waiting for me to serve them. "No," I said, smiling. "I think we've got it." And standing there, I finally understood that 30 guests had never been the real problem. The problem was being surrounded by people who measured my love by how much exhaustion I was willing to tolerate. Diane had ordered me into the kitchen at 4 in the morning. But by **3, 35**, I was in the sky, leaving 30 empty plates behind and taking my life back with me.